Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to another joint presentation from the Bill Holmes Center at the Burke Museum and the Friends of Native Art. I'm Bob Moore. I'm president of Friends of Native Art. And if you came in through the Bill Holmes Center or some other way and are not familiar with us, we are a Seattle-based organization of appreciators and collectors of Indigenous art with a particular focus on the Northwest coast of North America. If you think you might be interested in joining our organization, we do have regular programs and sometimes trips. If you're interested, you can get more information by sending an email to phonaseattle@gmail.com. I'd like to start this evening's events by reminding everyone that wherever we are in North America, we are on Indigenous land. And for the majority of us who may be in the Puget Sound region, we are predominantly on the lands of the Coast Salish peoples. I'll let Bridget do a formal introduction, but I would like to mention a couple of things about our speaker tonight. Neel should be speaking on the topic of the importance of artists and traditional knowledge keepers in the process of repatriation. And in addition to the many things about her in the biography that was set out with the announcement, I'd like to mention that she is in addition to being an outstanding artist herself, she is a descendant of some very well-known Kwakwaka'wakw artists, including Ellen Neel, her grandmother, who was one of the very first important women carvers, or at least, let me say, one of the first women carvers to come to the notice of the settler community. And her great-great-grandfather, Ellen Neel's grandfather, was the carver James, I'm sorry, I just spaced on his first name.
Charlie James.
Charlie James. And if you look over my shoulder, you can see a model pole carved by Charlie James, which I put up there especially for tonight. So with that, I'll turn it over to Bridget Johnson from the Bill Holmes Center to do some more introductions and give Neel the formal introduction she deserves.
Thank you so much, Bob. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Bridget Johnson. I'm the Assistant Director at the Bill Holmes Center for the Study of Northwest Native Art. And we're really been enjoying hosting these virtual presentations with the Friends of Native Art. And we're so grateful for the support and very excited to have Neel here with us tonight. And before I do my formal introduction, I just want to share that it's for tonight's presentation, it will be best if you put it in speaker mode, but I will be pinning or spotlighting Luann, so she'll be the main focus during her presentation. And if you have any questions during Luann's presentation, you can go ahead and drop them in the chat and I can read them at the end, or, this is usually pretty informal. So if you just at the end of the presentation, if you'd like to unmute and ask Luann a question, please feel free. So it's my great privilege to introduce our speaker tonight, Neel. Luann is many things. She's from the Mamalikwala and Kwagyuf people of the Kwakwaka'wakw, the Kwakwala speaking people. And Luann is a longtime friend of the Burke and the Bill Holmes Center. She received a Bill Holmes Center visiting researcher grant back in 2013 and has since been, a featured artist in the Burke Museum's 2014 and 2015 exhibition Here and Now, Native Artists Inspired. It was curated by our own Katie Bunn-Marcuse. And most recently, she was a co-curator in our inaugural exhibition in the Northwest Native Art Gallery at the Burke Museum. And her section is still currently on display when you can go visit. now or anytime. Luann comes from a rich history, as you heard, of artists on both sides of her family. And she has been practicing in the Kwakwaka'wakw design for over 40 years. Neel creates works in a variety of media, including jewelry, textiles and hides, paintings and prints, and even digital or vector designs. She has also spent the last 40 years volunteering as an advocate for the rights of Indigenous artists across Canada, including seeking support for the establishment of Indigenous arts organizations that can provide local and regional support to Indigenous artists, both emerging artists and professional artists, and as well as advocating for the important changes to the Copyright Act and other cultural and intellectual property laws. So in addition to her volunteer work, her arts practice, and her professional work as a curator, Luann is also the acting head of the Indigenous Collections and Repatriation at the Royal British Columbia Museum. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, Luann Neel.
Leila Kasla. Thank you so much. Leila Kasla, Ikyat Wagatlan. Yayutlin Lacha Mamalilakla to Aquagil. Lamka and Leila Kasla Laquangan. The Ehiskala Gachans, Konskachela Hoch, a Wheatnaquisas. What I've said in my language of Kwakwala is my one of my names, which is Ikyatwega. That comes from the Kwagil side of my family. I talked about that I'm from the Mamalilakla as well, and just offered my sincerest thanks to the people called the Lekwungen, the Coast Salish tribe in what's now called Victoria, and thanking them for always making me feel so welcome in the lands of their ancestors. And it really is a great privilege to join you today. I was just saying to Bridget before we got started, this is such a beautiful way to bring to a close a very busy week, the first week back to work at the museum. As Bridget mentioned, I have quite a diverse background, and I was just saying to somebody yesterday, I don't know how this happened exactly, but I have a rough idea that I've spent so much of my life wanting so dearly to spend all of my life being an artist, because you can just continue learning and you never stop learning and practicing. But somewhere along the way, and I think it was when I worked with the federal government when I was just out of high school and in my first year of college, I had a summer job with the federal government, and for some reason opened up these binders that contained policy. And I started reading these policies, and I took a real interest in them. So I actually started taking binders home with me. That's when I realized what a geek I was. And I started studying, and I really understood it. And I couldn't figure out why we seemed to be having a trouble in the department I was working in, going from policy to everyday practice. And it occurred to me that maybe they're not talking to everyday people to find out how these things should work. So I ended up going on to the University of Victoria into the public admin studies. And one of the programs that they offered back in the early 90s was called the Administration of Aboriginal Governance. And we spent a lot of time exploring and picking apart policies, programs, and models of governance and talking about models of governance. It was so well before its time because we hadn't even, we were only about a year away in BC of setting up a modern day treaty process with the provincial and federal governments and First Nations. So I felt like the timing was really good because it placed me right at the beginning of some really amazing discussions that now, 30 years later, I still get to be involved in all of these discussions. So part of those early discussions, what I got interested in was around how artists and art policy affects artists, cultural people, and especially our traditional languages. And we've always been many people before me who have spent, especially from our community, spent their entire careers and lifetimes working to revitalize our languages, working to bring back our art forms, and then reinstating all of the things we lost culturally during the potlatch ban. And I'm not sure if everyone understands what the potlatch ban is or has heard about it, but it was a part of legislation in Canada and people were actually imprisoned for carrying out our cultural practices. Excuse me. So what I wanted to share with you tonight was, as a result of all of this history, this very complex history that First Nations people in Canada have encountered, we're at a place now where we're seriously talking about not only repatriation, but this broader topic of reconciliation. And when we started talking about the two, it was, for me, it felt like immediately like repatriation is reconciliation in action. It's this act of making the effort to return cultural treasures back to communities that, especially, there were no documentation for them having been collected or gathered ethically. Sometimes the paperwork just never got filled out, even if they were purchased. But the burden of proof on the part of this Crown agency, the Royal BC Museum, the burden of proof was on the museum. And we were pretty hard pressed to find documents, a document trail for some of these beautiful cultural treasures. So the repatriation efforts started really early, actually. There were bits and pieces along the way in the 70s and 80s, because some communities had come forward even that early and said, you have things that belong to us, and they were taken out of our community without our permission. We can't imagine that you have a paper trail for it, so we do want them back. And so those things were repatriated early on. The program that I'm working on right now with the museum actually started around about 2016, 2017, and then hit the news in 2018, or rather late 2017. And the province decided to provide funds to the Royal BC Museum to get started on a really intense repatriation program, and much more comprehensive. So my predecessor, Lucy Bell from Haida Gwaii, started that work. She had done a lot of work with the Haida Gwaii Museum and the Haida Repatriation Committee. So it was a really fortuitous, I thought, for the museum to be able to call her in and get this entire program started. And it also meant that we had to completely reorganize our departments to make sure all of the affected departments were working together. So I took over for Lucy just about a year and a half ago. She's gone on to do her PhD studies. And because I have a background in the arts, some of the work that Lucy and I talked about fairly early on was around supporting the inclusion of artists and really targeting some of our efforts at artists, because some people in communities don't call themselves artists. They're practicing, they create works, they're doing what they have been passed down through their family. But they may not regard themselves as artists. And in some of my travels throughout the 90s and early 2000s, I did several stints around the province into First Nations communities, mostly teaching grant writing and portfolio development and things very much related to the arts and how to protect your copyright. But while I was doing those travels, I found it fascinating the number of people who not only didn't consider themselves artists, but were never going to call themselves artists. They didn't want to apply for funding. They thought that there would be too many strings attached. So they were really amazing conversations, and I drew a lot from those visits. And so what we ended up talking about was the things that are sitting in museums, private collections, and other public collections and government collections. And a lot of people said, you know, if somebody would just call me up, I could actually go in and tell them about those pictures they keep putting on their magazines, or every time they do a news story about our particular tribe, they'll show a picture of this one pole, and they don't realize that that's only representative of one family. So the more I heard that, the more I thought, you know, I know, because I was going into the Royal BC Museum back when it was still the Provincial Museum, when I was in high school. And I spent, again, I think I was more of a geek than I wanted to admit to myself, but I was in the archives every Saturday and Sunday, just looking through everything I possibly could to understand where our treasures went. Where are the treasures that my grandmother carved? Where are the treasures my great-grandfather carved? My great-uncle was Mungo Martin, and his work was everywhere because he worked at the museum. So it was a really amazing series of conversations that very much informed what I ended up doing once I started at the museum. So one of the first things that I took as a project or created a project from when I arrived there was really thanks to Richard Hunt. Richard Hunt and I worked together, and I worked really closely with his brother, the late Tony Hunt Sr., with the dance group for many, many years. But Richard was the last master carver at the museum in the original carving studio program. And next to the museum in Thunderbird Park was a carving studio that was built when Mungo Martin first came in the late 40s, early 50s. And all of the replicas in Thunderbird Park were carved in that very carving studio. And they used to just call it the carving shed. Eventually, the Hunt family, and Richard was one of them, rotated through, and everybody spent time in this carving shed, learning from Mungo, learning from Doug Cranmer, practicing. Henry Hunt was there as well. And Richard and I got to talking because him and I had done an artist project back in the early 90s. And he said to me, you know, people have been asking me when that carving shed is going up again. And he said, and I didn't know who to talk to, but so I'm really glad you're there now at the museum. What is going to happen with it? And so I brought it to our executive and asked if we could do a series of consultations with the artists who used to work in the carving shed over the decades and other artists that might be interested if we were to build this carving studio again. What that morphed into, we ended up setting up a series of 4 discussions over 4 months, and we brought in everybody who had ever done work in that carving studio. So our reach was mostly on Vancouver Island through the 3 island nations, the Coast Salish, the Nuu-chah-nulth, and the Kwakwaka'wakw, and several artists that came from the mainland as well, or who were now residing in the mainland. And we had full day sessions where we just talked through what was the importance of that carving studio? Why was it significant? Why was it significant to each and every artist? Because we knew that was going to be different for each one of them. But not surprisingly, what most of them said was that what they really appreciated about having that space right there beside the museum was that they not only got to educate the public before they went into the museum, they themselves would be able to get time in behind the scenes in the collections to study historic pieces. And in some cases, the artists would find pieces that belonged to their family tree that might have even been carved by parents, uncles, or aunties, or created by, it's not just carvings, but created by family members. So they talked about how important that was, and that they had actually helped the curators at that time complete the records. And so that was the first big light bulb that went for me. And so we started to gather the information and the feedback from artists, talked about how could we do this in a very modern way, still give you the opportunity if we were to rebuild the shed, how would we do that? And the artists gave us such great feedback about one of the main things they talked about was the fact that the carving shed had always just been a carving shed. So the carvers had their own exclusive space. But even the carvers came back and said, this needs to be a multidisciplinary space, because the reality is in your collections, you have weaving, you have painting, you have cedar bark work, you have the whole range of work that our artists did traditionally and are doing now in contemporary times. And you need to create space for all of that, not just for the carvers, but they still wanted their own space as well. So, so we started to develop a model of that and put that forward to the powers that be to look at how we would fundraise and construct this and reconstruct the carving studio. In the meantime, what we thought we would do is try out some of what the artists told us. They gave us ideas on what we could do. And so one of the things was reviving this idea of getting the artists behind the scenes into the collections and booking enough time that they could come back and visit several times over, because one visit isn't ever going to do it. And it's such a vast collection. So the first summer we were able to invite artists. And what we did was recognize that artists can't step away from their studios for too long of a time because that's their livelihood. And we were very fortunate to find funding that we were offered the artists a stipend that they could spend an average of 3 days a week with us over the entire summer. And we rotated people in and out each week. And we gave them a stipend. We covered their meals. We gave them the things like parking things that we never think about, and welcomed them as our guests. Gave them space where they could do their work and interact with the public and the museum staff as well. So they did that. And then we booked them to come into the collections. And what they did was they very much like how the Burke is set up. We have the online collections. We asked them to spend some time going through the online collections to select items that they wanted pulled and ready for them to study. So we did follow that process. And here again, we had 2 generations later, the descendants of some of the original artists were coming in and helping us to complete some records. This was so important because we were already at a point where we had about 25 communities from around the province that were actively requesting repatriation of various cultural items. So these artists were able to help fill in some blanks or at least point us in the new direction than we were going, so that we could make sure that we got the information we needed to carry out the repatriation appropriately. So that was the summer of, I believe, 2019. We went the whole summer, and then we got back together at the end of summer and debriefed and talked about how that went and what could be done to improve things. And they gave us some feedback, which was really excellent. And some of the highlights of that were for the artist program to be expanded a little bit to become an artist in residence program of some sort that we could do in conjunction with the fine arts programs that some of the artists were participating in, and just make those kinds of partnerships possible, but also for artists to be able to do drop-in and set up some time to come in and give advice. The other part was that they wanted to make sure that we were talking with artists about replicating. Some communities told us that they already were aware of pieces that were in the museum. They were also aware that they were one-of-a-kind pieces, the last remaining pieces, at least as far as they know, because they hadn't had a chance to look at other museums around the world. And so they were afraid that the knowledge and the histories and the history of that particular piece would be forgotten. And in some cases, for some communities, people weren't even aware that they had pieces like that to begin with, because so much time had passed. So we took those recommendations and built them into our new program to ensure that not only artists, but elders could come in, and we recommended an elders in residence program as well, and visiting elders program to come along with the artists and have discussions, but also so that when those discussions were happening, they would also have some young people who were working on learning their respective languages and learning to write in their languages. And the First Peoples Cultural Council here in BC funds a lot of those programs, funds mentor apprentice programs. So there were some really beautiful synergies that were possible there. And all of that ended up getting put into our new proposal, which was to have a whole series of different people coming through from each tribal group, looking at different cultural items and providing what information. But we really wanted to make sure that we weren't just taking. We wanted to figure out what we were giving in return. And so we also looked at how we would plan for college and university students, because they'll be working during the summer with the museum, to hire them to work with these groups of artists and elders and young people doing the language. And they would document what they could to give back to all of them at the end of their visit. And so we started the process of digitizing all of our photo collection. We're still very much in the thick of that, but we did get 16,000 photos scanned within a 2-year period. And we started to put those scanned photos onto flash drives. And every time someone came to visit, we would give them a flash drive with all of the photos we had scanned so far from the nation. That winter in 2019, we also invited the artists to come back and participate in an artist market so that they could have even more interaction with the public. What we heard from the public, we didn't do a formal survey, but we were getting comments on our museum's regular comment card system, and visitors from around the world and local people who live locally commented over and over again how much they appreciated seeing something like the carving program going again. They were thrilled. We had people come in and search for me exactly and say, I remember Mungo. I came here when I was a child and Mungo was carving a pole. My parents brought me here and I still have the wood chip that Mungo gave me from his work he was doing at that time. It was just beautiful to see this multi-generational and this audience from all parts of the globe letting us know that they remember that program and they were happy to hear that we were working on it again. So when we did the Winterfest, we were looking at more of the commercial side of the arts because the artists who had spent the summer with us were making works that were for the commercial market. So we asked them to bring those pieces back so that they could hopefully sell them. Every one of the artists almost sold out of everything they had. The museum membership were invited and told that this Winterfest was going to happen. So they got first dibs at shopping. And then the staff came second, and then the general public. It was, I think we did 3 days of market, and it was probably one of the most successful programs we'd ever run right inside the museum's lobby. So that took place, and after all that, we debriefed again, and that's when we started running into COVID. And of course, we've all experienced it. All of our best plans came to a grinding halt and are still sitting, waiting to implement. We did have funders lined up to do a very similar program to the summer program in a condensed form. We were going to do that in our second summer, 2020. But of course, COVID affected that as well. It still wasn't safe. So we're hoping that we'll be able to do something this summer. It may still be scaled back. In the meantime, what we're doing is looking at how we can digitize more photos, how we can do 3D renderings, photo renderings or photogrammetry of objects so that we can make those available for artists and actually get some of that work started at least. How much can we accomplish virtually? So that's what we're looking at right now. And we've just done our first 30 masks that we've had our photographer do a full photogrammetry. So when it gets stitched together and rendered, it becomes this, you can manipulate the image and see the full 3D of it on your screen. And I let our photographer know that, you know, what we were looking for is, as a very much an emerging carver myself, I would want to look and zoom in and close up at every single cut of a carving. I want to look at the angle of the cut. I want to see how smooth it was or if it was deliberately textured, all of those considerations. So we're just gonna, our first 30 pictures are going to be ready tomorrow. So the timing of this talk is really good. And we're going to see if that looks like it's going to work. And if so, then we'll put some resources into getting many more pieces three-dimensionally photographed and make those available online. And over time, what we're hoping is, you know, when we get into next winter and travel isn't as possible for anybody during the winter months, that we'll still be able to use these photos widely across all nations. Now, one of our biggest challenges is that there are 35 different cultural groups in BC alone, 35 different languages with all the dialects that flow out from those. And the museum currently has 18 of the 35 nations or cultural groups represented in the collection. But even with 18, and you consider that there's about 15,000 objects in the collection under the old ethnology department, and probably 65,000 existing photos that still need to be digitized, and then documents for miles that all relate to these objects. We have a great deal of digitizing work to do because we also want to make sure that, again, in that spirit of reciprocity and respect for the nation, being able to put things on flash drives, give them back to communities, create scans, do some printing for communities that might need that, and especially being able to reach more remote communities and so that their service isn't affected just because they can't actually travel to Victoria. So we have a few different things that are on the go right now. Now, in addition to artists being able to feed into and give that information, I was started to talk a little bit about replicas. Some of the artists did tell us after their first visit into the collections during our first summer program that these really frail objects needed to have replicas created. And so what we asked them was for a little bit more advice on, because we haven't done this before, what would the protocols be? Who would be giving the permission? Who are you creating the replica for? And it actually ended up being not as complex as we thought it was going to be. The example I use, this isn't the actual mask that we did, but the example I use is a wolf mask. If there was a Nuchano's wolf mask in the collection, and it was the only wolf mask in the collection, the only example of that style, we would know from the community that that wolf mask would belong to a very specific family and probably a specific dancer, would have been created for the dancer. And that's the path we would have to follow to get permission, along with the artist, to get permission for that artist to create the replica. Part of it is also that we would be asking the community or the family, who would you like to designate as the carver that comes in, studies this, and then creates the replica? So it's always a two-way street that we're trying to create here. And really respectfully setting any biases aside that may be on the museum, in the museum community, to say, we have to learn a new way of doing this. We have to learn an entirely new process. We have to create an entirely new process. And that's going to not only change the way we do business at the museum, it's also going to ultimately dovetail with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that's a really big focus of my work right now, is everything I'm doing, everything I've done in the last 4 years, I'm going back and revisiting and making sure that if we didn't address something specific that we see now in UNDRIP, that we have plans to do that. So creating replicas is going to be a complex project for some communities. Some communities do not want to create replicas. They've said these pieces are very stable and we want the originals back. But we might consider creating a replica to give to you. And now this is a really interesting thought, because it really shifts the way we're thinking around how the museum collects, making sure we have a budget to commission pieces, to be able to create those proper paper trails and the provenance of pieces, and to really talk with the communities about what they want their museum to have to represent their history. When we talk about the museum, the Provincial Museum, the Royal BC Museum being representative of the history of British Columbia, we haven't told that, we haven't even collected on the true full history of BC, because we only have 18 of 35 nations represented already. So we have a few things that need to be balanced out. Many of the interior tribes, the early ethnologists and anthropologists and archaeologists mostly traveled along the coast because of the waterways, and that was an easier way to travel, especially with equipment. So some of the interior tribes weren't visited, and so therefore things weren't collected. And if there were the occasional items collected, they may have been in more in the modern era, maybe in the 60s and 70s, but we're still missing out on entire histories there. So lots of things that we're juggling at the same time. And the last piece I'll just share before, and I'll stop and pause and see if there's any questions yet, is around policy and governance. And one of the things that we talked about with the artists especially was that they really felt like they didn't want to be in a program. They didn't want to be regarded as program participants. They wanted, again, to align with the UN Declaration, but also to really assert the sovereignty each of the nations have here in BC. It's still unceded territory. There aren't treaties everywhere. So people talked about how they needed to be in control of how they went about things, and that the relationship between artists community and the museum needed to change significantly. And we also needed to have discussions about how conservators interacted with artists, because that was a really big item that several artists said they felt like they'd been scolded by conservators for not putting on gloves or whatever, but they weren't told that they should put on gloves for their own protection. So so there were a few matters around that. So one of the things that the artists recommended and that the museum was very much in agreement with was that the artists would come together outside of the museum to create their own co-op. And I've been doing a lot of research into artist co-ops over the years, and just actually different models of organization to determine what would be well suited to Indigenous community arts organizations. And the co-op model was the closest thing to a traditional model. This idea or these principles of you get out of it what you put into it, and that everybody has to contribute. And that seemed to be resonate the closest to how we function in our potlatch communities as well. So this idea of the community artists setting up their own co-op, and what the museum would do was still create the carving studio again. But if we were approved to get a major renovation to the current building, that we would incorporate an artist co-op space, so that some of the painters or weavers or people who needed a specialized space, and especially access to electricity, could still carry out their work inside the museum. And so the museum would create the space, but the co-op would actually run the space. And this was really exciting because in Canada, we have the Canada Council for the Arts, and we have provincial arts councils as well. And in BC, we have the First Peoples Cultural Council. So there's actually arts funding, whether it's operational group programs or individual arts grants, that are available to our communities that aren't available to an organization such as the Royal BC Museum, because we're a government entity, we're a Crown Corporation. We can't apply for those monies, but the community can, to run their own programs, and we would serve as the good hosts that provide the space. So everyone was in agreement with that, and this would allow for the co-op to create a governance structure that could interact with the museum's governance structure, and with our Indigenous Advisory Committee as well, to make decisions at that level that would benefit the whole community. So that's where we left off, and where we're sitting, waiting to re-implement the summer program again, to bring back not just a winter market, but a summer market. Hopefully a market for every season is what we would ideally love. And then also look forward to whatever our building plans are going to be. And at the very least, getting the old carving studio set up again, so that the artist co-op can still be housed somewhere local, and we can continue the work we've been doing to match up the artists with the repatriation work that's going on. Yeah, pause button.
Thank you so much, Luann. That was so many ideas. That's just so
that's the surface.
I know there's so much going on there, but first of all, thank you so much. You are just a wealth of information, a wealth of knowledge. We do have 2 questions in the chat, and I can go ahead and ask those for you. So from Gail, are there repatriation projects that have been as successful as the Alert Bay Kwakwaka'wakw experience and the museum?
Oh, that's a part of my brain I have to reactivate. Well, first of all, one of the things that I was advised by communities and our advisory committee was that the top priority for repatriation for this museum was the return of ancestral remains. So in that regard, yes, there were over, I think we were just under 3,000 ancestral remains. And when Lucy came in, her and the team did a whole bunch of work to take all the remains out of the plastic bags and plastic boxes, and had a ceremony that was guided by the local Lekwungen and the Tsumenas people from Up Island. And they helped to do a cleansing and then a food burning, and rewrapped all of those ancestral remains. And what that actually did in practical terms for us was gave us the ability to go back through and count exactly how many remains there were, because they had been there for so long and nobody was paying any attention to them. So we weren't actually precisely down to the number. That process actually took quite a bit longer than we thought. Our archaeologist and our repatriation specialist now actually just spent the last 4 months going back through for about the 4th time to verify all of the ancestors, checking them against the Borden numbers, making sure that they had the correct permits lined up with those ancestors, and making sure they knew which communities these came from. One of the first successes we had was over the course of the first year, 2018, 2019, we were able to return, let's see, we're at 5, I think it was 1,200. So over half of the remains were returned home. And each of those communities, because we had a grant program for repatriation, the grant program, which I ran, and I set it up and then I ran it, out of 21 communities that applied for that grant, a third of them wanted specifically to work on ancestral remains, and that's what we did. And so we made sure that all of the expenses related to the return of those ancestors was borne by the museum. So every time the community came to the museum to do ceremony, because there was lots of preparation ceremony, and some communities had to come 3 or 4 times and do work before they could actually take them home. And then there was lots of work still to be done and planning to be done in the community, the final resting place for these ancestors, but also a kind of a celebration when they came home. And so the grant money, I made sure that that our advisory and the museum approved this idea that it might just look like a luncheon to you, but this is a ceremony that we're doing here, and we feed people always. So some of that money was used to host those gatherings once ancestors went home. So that, I think, was probably the biggest success in the 2018-2019 year. And we expended, I believe it was close to $500,000 in grants. And all of those grants were successful. And some of them were designed to get set up for the next phase and several phases later. And some of those communities are still in discussions with us because they're deciding what they want to bring home first. And they're deciding whether or not they have a safe space for those pieces. We're not telling them you have to have a Class A museum. We're not having that discussion. That's not our policy. So that's really successful. So we're down now to, I believe it's just under 700 ancestral remains. We've been in discussion with all of those communities in the past year, and we are hoping that by the end of this summer, all of the ancestral remains will have been returned home.
Wonderful. Thank you, Luann. A question from Rita Moore. For pieces that are being repatriated, do you plan to do the 3D pictography before they leave the museum, or do you need permission from tribes or communities before you can do this?
I just had that discussion today. We thought we were going to photograph them before they left, and then we realized, hey, we can't do that. We have to ask. So we actually have a full 2-year engagement process I don't think it's going to be enough, but it'll be a start. Our first 2 years of community engagement, that's going to be incorporated into our questions. Some of it's a little more urgent because some of you may have seen on the news that our third floor galleries have been closed and that we're reworking them. So the case that the 33 pieces that we've already photographed were pieces that families already gave permission to photograph before and that they wanted photographs of them. So we did the photogrammetry under those permissions. But we will have to go back and contact communities more directly. And because we were developing a plan, a very methodical plan, timeline of which of the cases in the third floor exhibit hall are going to be decanted next, those are the people we're going to contact. So we do have sort of a method to the madness. Where it's going to really hit the road is when we go into our full collections building and all the other thousands of items that we have to consider. So like I say, I'll get it started and I'll be long retired before we even reach the halfway mark.
Let's get it all nice and set up.
It's really interesting though to set up those new processes. They're really important. I think just having the discussion about we have to ask permission, that we can't just make these assumptions on our own. It surprised a lot of my colleagues. It surprised them that level of permission was necessary. And I said, you know what? If you do it at this level on this, conversational phones, you should be able to phone somebody up. We can follow up with paperwork later. In a perfect world without COVID, I would travel to the community. I would bring things to them. I would present gifts to them and ask them to have this conversation and show them what's possible, and probably just show something like from my own family. But we can't do that right now. So it's really piqued the interest of the department heads in all the other disciplines, because we also have different relationships that have formed over time within our different scientific communities and the First Nations communities that they're studying. So and I like to pick on botany because they're my favorite people. But when the botanists go out and they're looking at different plant species, and some of these artistic works are based on these plant species. So the permissions to even go out and do field work, is something that wasn't thought of before, was never done before, and now is very much becoming part of new practice.
Thank you. So we have a couple questions from Kurt. The first one is, how does the museum work with the First Nations communities regarding the continued preservation of these sometimes extremely fragile, quote unquote, temperature and humidity sensitive, or like you mentioned, potentially hazardous due to preservation methods, nature of their repatriated material culture?
Well, a little bit of luck on our side right now that we haven't had anything that contains pesticides or any harmful materials. We have 2 of our staff got their XRF training this year so that they're able to scan the works and see if there are any hazardous pesticides or anything on different pieces. And we've made all items that are flagged for repatriation are the priority. So they're just going through one at a time and testing all of the pieces. We've only had, and I wasn't personally involved in this, but I believe we had a couple of pieces that went back to the Utmista in Alert Bay and did have some pesticide or arsenic on them. But thankfully, on the other end, there was a collection manager, Juanita Johnson, who was able to convey that information out to the community, to people who come to visit the piece, and understand that this is what happened during the journey of this particular mask. And so we haven't luckily had to deal with that yet, but we're preparing for that. So part of how we're preparing is making sure we test everything, that we're updating our databases so that people will know that. Our public facing databases will speak to that when we've gone through and checked all these things. But this is part of why we wanted to talk with artists about replicating and being able to keep something that just really shouldn't be, that people shouldn't be exposed to at all. That we, if we can negotiate keeping it at the museum and have replicas made, we want to do that. The other thing we have to do is we haven't had specific storage because nobody's been doing this testing. We haven't had specific safe storage for these pieces. And so that's a plan that we're working on as well, is if we are given the opportunity to rebuild or do a major renovation on our building, that we will create much more safe spaces for the pieces that do have contaminants on them. So they still can be viewed, they still can be handled, but that we would also have different spaces where these could be taken out of their cases and viewed in proper ventilation. So lots of different things for moving forward, and just very fortunate that we haven't had any problems with that up to now, but we're very aware that that there's probably going to be quite a few pieces that are affected.
Yes, sure. Thank you. Another question from Kurt as well is there an intermediary, such as the museum, that cooperates with or supports the First Nations in repatriation efforts outside of the province or country?
That was the plan from the beginning with the program that was started up in 2017-18. We've only done a little bit of that. We had some early conversations with some of the tribes that received the grants, who wanted specifically to look at the Chicago Field Museum, or they had some pieces in New York. So there was only a couple of them. The intent was that when I took over the role of repatriation specialist, when it was first set up, that I would connect with all these museums. And it didn't go as we planned, partially because we're all at different levels. Some of us have databases, some of us have really complete databases, and some of us have not so complete databases. So it wasn't all that easy. If you had this tribe wanting to talk to this museum, it wasn't always a perfect match for what was needed and what they actually had. It was also a real challenge because not all museums were prepared to talk about repatriation. And but when we did publish and release the repatriation handbook, that actually, we ended up with a little bit of a lull where we didn't hear from anybody for a long time and nobody would return my calls. But when the book came out, people started looking at it in museums around the world and were thrilled and said, okay, this isn't as difficult as I said. It's complex, but it's not impossible. And it is going to take some time, and nobody's expecting you to have, the back gates open for the truck to roll in and take everything out. That's not going to happen that way. The communities themselves need time to prepare. So let's just start the conversation. And if we can be on the same page, literally and figuratively, about how we're all going to go about this. So there was a lot more willingness and interest from international museums to connect. And through a series of conferences that Lucy and I presented at in the first 2 years, we met colleagues finally face to face. And so the interest level and the cooperation was much better. We haven't, and actually, I think there was something about us saying that we would support the community and help with whatever they needed, actually seemed to encourage other museums that communities were already talking to just go on ahead. And I think it was kind of a combination of knowing that they wouldn't be the first, knowing there was a handbook now, and knowing that the museum was taking such a strong stance for its own collection, that other museums were able to make things happen a little more quickly for those communities. We still have a long way to go on that, though, too.
Yes. But I, as a museum professional, I really appreciate this work that you're doing and setting, raising everyone up, raising other museums up to these standards.
Well, I just love talking with colleagues from around the world. It's so exciting. And I want to mention before I forget, because I do that, is the Repatriation Handbook. When we first published it, our intention was that we were going to create a series, several volumes that would just continue to document what we were learning as we go. what we will probably do, partially because of COVID, is we're going to, first of all, connect with all the communities with whom we've done a repatriation, whether it's ancestral remain or specific cultural treasures. And we're going to work with them to co-write some stories and accounts of how that process went for them. And we are going to talk a little bit technical about what happened behind the scenes in policy and process and conflicting interests. We also are going to have to very soon on a number of repatriations we're talking about right now. We're going to start getting into the really interesting part, which is what if two opposing community members ask for the same piece? We don't have a ready-made answer for that, but we're very fortunate to have, I think, the wisdom of elders and the leaders in the community, the hereditary leaders, who are very clear about the parameters around what belongs to certain families. So that's going to help a lot. But we will be doing updates. So it won't come right now in the form of a book. We want to get everything online and just expedite that as much as we can. So Michelle Washington, our new repatriation specialist, is going to be reconnecting with communities that we're in discussions with, talk about pulling those stories together and get those online on our website. And we'll think about the publishing end of it a little bit later.
That's great. And accessibility is so crucial.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Kurt says, thank you so much.
You're welcome, Kurt. Good question.
Yeah, a couple questions from Zoe. First, I'll ask, what is your favorite part of your work and what is the most challenging part?
The favorite is always working with the artists. I love it. And because it's sort of a multi-pronged benefit for me. When I get to welcome an artist into the collection, sit there with them for a while with the works that they're looking at, the treasures they're looking at, it also, I get to learn. I get to learn hearing their own anecdotal stories, their own histories, stories of them talking with their grandparents and aunts and uncles and others in the community. So that's really rich for me. And it enables me to just do my job a lot better. It really opens up. When I hear an artist talk about, this item is actually very secret. This is from our secret society. And you shouldn't actually even be in the room looking at it. And I'll step away if they tell me that, because I really believe in that. And so what's really extra rewarding for me is that I get to learn that. And then I can share that with my colleagues and we can all be respectful with our guests. So, and with our community partners. So that's the favorite part of it. The least favorite is always the report writing. I mean, even though as I go, I'm always, and I'm, this is a public admin geek side of me. I actually keep notes, bullet notes for my reports as I go through the month. And so quarterly, I'll pull all my notes together and I'll just throw in a few connector words and there's my report. It still takes a lot of time and my brain's in such a different space. But I can get through it. It's just not my favorite. I wish I could just hit record and talk about it and send them the video.
Yeah, I mean, that's a report.
That's a report. I think that'd be great. Show them some pictures. Here's
Yeah.
what we did.
That's what we need to do.
Yeah.
Update the reporting process. Zoe also asked, how may settlers on both an individual and institutional level best support Indigenous artists?
Oh, gosh. Wow. I'm looking at this big drop down menu from my head here. Going,
right.
What
Where
first?
do I begin?
I think within the context of museums and repatriation, I'll just narrow it to
There
that.
you go.
I think the best thing we can do is really learn what you can from the artists, take those opportunities to learn about their practice and the works they create and why they create them. I think some of the most frustrating parts about this, being an artist and then being a museum professional, is it's frustrating when like those sacred objects, things that come from secret societies, On the ancestral remains side, people having skulls on their mantle, stuff like that. I get those calls every day, all day. And it's really difficult to cover an entire history with a stranger on the phone. And if the individual is able to do some research, talk to an artist, explore a little bit. If you have an item and you want to know more about it, go, we have Google it, look online, see what you can find first before approaching a museum professional. It's difficult for me because I really want to answer their question, but it could take days to answer their question. And it already takes a lot of time to narrow it down to what are you really asking me? And what I'm finding most often is that if people, I think artists need to hear from more of us, sign your work, sign it and date it. Sign it and date it. I'm always telling artists that. And I tell them, you're not going to reach that million unless you sign it and date it. So, so I can, and I've seen some of the young artists who've been in my workshop, I see them signing their work and yay. But what happens inevitably is the collector, the person who receives that piece, or someone who receives it as a gift even, they come back to us, or their children or their grandchildren, how many generations later, and say, hey, I have this piece. I think it's from the coast. It looks like it is. And I don't know who made it. I don't know where it came from. And I don't know what tribal style it is or anything. Can I send you a picture? And then, of course, pictures aren't always great on a screen, but it's very frustrating. And there's a part that everybody can play in that. If you're in communication anyway, just say, there's this old artist, Luann, who told me one time that she really encouraged artists to sign their stuff, even if you think that it's not traditional. We are not in traditional times. We're all here in modern times right now. And this is part of what I say to artists too. No, you don't see artist signatures on the bottom of totem poles or things like that, but their style used to be we could rely on style. Used to be that we could look at a specific artist and know that that's their piece. Just like I noticed the Charlie James pole earlier. It was just iconic and noticeable from everywhere. But it's not always going to be like that. And if you want to be recognized further on in your career, your stuff is just going to have to be signed. And then I showed some artists in my most recent workshops the beautiful signatures, well, we call them signatures, of the weavers. I love seeing Chilkat blankets with the weaver's signature on the bottom corner because it's so, that's what I'm trying to say to artists. So I started to build that into my artist presentations to say, yes, we always signed our work. Your great grandmother signed her work. So don't give me any excuses for it.
Yes. Great, thank you. So from Bird, what has been your experience navigating between repatriation as healing and reconciliation versus the historic colonial wounds leading to the need for repatriation in the first place?
Well, we're very much in the midst of that right now. And it's very, I'm a residential school survivor as well. So it's very on multiple layers. It's very triggering. And I've actually been having conversations, sharing from that museum perspective with the communities that we're working with right now, and really encouraging them to look at new creative ways of doing healing work in the communities before coming to visit. Lucy said this, Nika Collison, when Lucy and Nika and I were writing the Repatriation Handbook, and we included a piece about this in the book itself, to just remind communities that it's going to trigger you when you come into these colonial institutions. You're going to get triggered. You're not going to know that's going to happen. Nobody ever does. That's why it's a trigger. And that we all have to be really mindful, and be mindful also that the people who are there in the museum now aren't the people who did this. They've been housing the collection and caring for the collection since, but it's not going to do anyone any good to take out the frustration on an employee, because then, you know, we're all affecting our relationships, and on vice versa, talking internally with our own staff to say, you're going to have to really be careful. You need to choose your words carefully. Conservators, really explain why you want people to wear gloves. Really explain why you're cautious about lifting certain pieces, especially if they're fragile and you know, in danger of falling apart. Explain that. People will get it. It's the lack of that communication that causes the problems, but it's also that not realizing what you're gonna feel when you get in there. And so both Lucy and Nika talked to me about when they did one of their first trips to repatriate ancestral remains, and the container was opened and there was their ancestor. They said they never could have prepared. They didn't prepare and they weren't prepared, and they cried for days, but they realized that they needed to, when they got home, to talk with the elders and figure out a way that is within their culture. Was it songs that they could do? Could they do a chant beforehand to keep themselves protected and cleansed? And were there any other cultural practices that were involved with the handling of human remains? So that was really great advice that they offered. And but I'm finding still that every 6 months something new comes up, because it depends on what the item is that the community is looking at.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Those were all the questions in the chat. If anybody wants to unmute and ask a question or use the hand raise option.
I would.
Oh, Bob, go ahead.
Yes, you a few minutes ago referred to the gallery closures at the museum, and I think many of us, perhaps most of us, saw the announcement that this was being done as part of a decolonization effort. And that word can mean many things, and I'd like you to, if you can, tell us what it means to the UBC Museum.
To the RBCM Museum?
I'm sorry, of course.
I thought, oh,
Yeah,
UBC's changing.
no,
I thought they just changed.
No, to the Royal BC Museum.
I'm happy to share that, because I feel sad that I haven't been able to say more about this up until now. Just flooded with tasks right now. One of the things that I even knew, I used to run around this museum when I was a kid. And I used to run around there partially because my brother was outside learning how to carve, so I had to travel with him down across town. But while he was carving, I'd go into the museum, and because we lived away from Alert Bay, I felt so at home around all the old pieces. So that's why I used to like hanging around there. But then I'd go and read what the labels said. And my favorite one to pick on is the display case that has the carving tools, and the label in front of this knife says knife. And I remember, you know, I'm so cheeky also. From the time I was a kid, I went, oh, knife, oh, who knew? And it really annoyed me, and I've carried that annoyed feelings from the time I was about 7. And so the decolonization part, and I'll just speak on the First Peoples Gallery side, it has been a long time coming. And the decolonizing is the labels you see and the pieces you see and the way they're presented are supposed to be about telling a story, telling a history, and our people have not had the opportunity to be a part of that storytelling. Somebody else has given labels to our precious possessions and haven't even given the correct labels to them. Some of them are not identified as being with a specific tribe, when, you know, and those people come in and from that tribe and go, how come it doesn't say Nuchano? How come it doesn't say Tlaoquiat? How come it doesn't say Tlatlasikwala? Why doesn't it say that? Do they not know how to spell our name? They've had years to learn. So I'm still hearing it from people, and I still feel that way about it. It also I find it really disrespectful that there are pieces that don't even have a label. You know, there's this one big write-up at the end of the display case. And so the visitor and the community member, they can come and look at these beautiful pieces of carvings and works and weavings and everything and walk away not actually know anything about it. So how is it that we're achieving our educational objectives if we don't even have educational information? So the decolonizing for me, and part of it, I'm doing right now with us taking that first case apart. I have the luxury of being able to hold those pieces and look at them and ask them, what is it we can do better now? What you tell me. And for me, it's, as an artist especially, I feel that energy when I hold those pieces. I feel what I'm compelled to think about what I should be doing well here and doing better and what I can do to improve it, along with everything I've been told from community members, especially. But I even had, I've had conversations with visitors from around the world who, I would occasionally just go to the gallery just to get a time out during the day. And I'd end up inevitably talking with visitors and having visitors say, why can't we know more about this? Why does that just say knife? Why does that just say totem pole? We figured as much, but where's it come from? And how'd you do it? What kind of wood is it? So that's a big part of what the decolonization on the First Peoples Gallery side. And the other part is that the colonizing perspective in the first place did not honor our hosts. And our hosts are the Lekwungen people. And there is very little evidence that that is the case in this museum. So we've been, and I've grown up with lots of Lekwungen friends, and now we all find ourselves working together, which we're all loving that. But it helps because we remember, all of us as kids, going there, and teenagers with our school groups, and them talking about how they never felt represented. They didn't see themselves in the exhibits. I loved it because it was all Kwakwakiwak and Haida, and I would just look at all the Kwakwakiwak and I think, I'm all right home. I feel great about this place. But I hadn't even thought about it when I was a kid, that maybe the nations here should be represented. So that's a really big part. The discussion about Thunderwood Park, the discussion about how that new carving shed will be built. One of the first things that all the artists said was, if you build it kind of in the style of a big house again, make sure it's in the Coast Salish style, and get the Coast Salish over here to guide every step of that so that it's done properly. So, so we're very fortunate that the Lekwungen have been gracious with us and have been good partners with us, and have really been giving us a lot of guidance on what we need to do different, along with all the other communities that we'll consult in the next 2 years.
Thank you.
Thank you, Luann. Any other questions?
If there are no more questions, I know Katie had something she wanted to announce.
Well, I want to allow Luann to wrap up in any way that she'd like to before I make an announcement at the very end before we leave off. So Luann, I'm just going to turn it back to you to say thank you so much for being here. And Bridget and I are madly taking notes about things that we can do more of at the Burke, and we can't wait to see you and visit with you. You've always been such a huge friend and participant in all of our programs. But I just wanted to give it back to you. Is there anything else that you wanted to wrap up with this evening?
You know what I'm really looking forward to, and I'm glad you mentioned our long-standing relationship, is I'm really looking forward, and I really thank you for this opportunity to share with you tonight. I think that there's so many more great partnerships, and so much of the work that you've been doing out of the Bill Holmes Center has been very much an influence on the work I'm doing, and really supports what I say. So thank you for doing that really important work. My time down there as an artist researcher really helped me. It was long before I came here to work at the museum, but and I knew when I was there, I'm looking at things and learning things that I don't even know what I'm going to use them for, but I'm going to store them. And I know they'll pop out at the right time. And just so you know, several of those things, especially the museum and its foundation getting a similar grant program for traveling artists. I've been saying it, Jack Lohman got sick of me saying it, but I'm going to keep saying it until we get it. So thank you for all of your inspiration and this great relationship that we have. Leila
Well,
Kessler.
Gayla Kessler to you, and I did not tee you up for that, but I so much appreciate our mutual admiration society. So that is really wonderful. And I want to actually remind everyone, if you want to hear more about Luann's scholarship on her family and particularly her great influence, Ellen Neel, you can read her chapter in Unsettling Native Art Histories on the Northwest Coast from UW Press and the Bill Holmes Center series. So read that because it's great. And then I also just wanted to let everyone know that you may have heard in the past, Robin Wright did tours with Blue Water Adventures up in Haida Gwaii in Southeast Alaska. And I've been talking with them about doing them, but of course, COVID's gotten in the way. So the Bill Holmes Center and Blue Water Tours are going to join up again in summer of 2023. So not this year, but the next. And I'll be going along, and we have a spot for, let's see, I think it's about 12 people to go on one of the Blue Water's beautiful sailing trips down into Guayhanas and see all of the old villages and visit with the Haida watchmen who are there and are so knowledgeable. And of course, just to see the beautiful land and marine waters of Haida Gwaii. So if anyone wants to join us, that will be July 17th to the 24th on Blue Water Tours. And we'll have lots more information coming out soon from the Bill Holmes Center. So that's my little advertisement to spend time with all of you. And I'll turn it back to Bridget and Bob. Yeah, it'll be fun.
Yes, thank you, Katie. And again, thank you so much, Luann. This has been just wonderful. And I'm so grateful that you were here to share all of your knowledge with all of us.
Thank you. It did go fast, didn't it?
It really did went a lot faster than
I was got to tell everybody, I was telling Bridget, I'm really sorry I didn't create a PowerPoint. I've got lots of PowerPoints, but what I end up doing is I pop the first one up on screen, then I start talking, and then nobody gets to see any of the rest of the PowerPoint.
Well, Luann, on behalf of FONA, I really want to thank you for a wonderful presentation. We learned so much from it. And these are issues all of us settlers who are interested in Indigenous art and collect Indigenous art need to be thinking about all the time. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Leila Kessler.